This is my current miter saw setup. It's pathetic. I have both of these saws slapped onto this table, which is one of like 4 that I made for moving stuff around my shop. I made them out of some old countertops. Initially, I put both of these saws on this table as a temporary setup. But that was almost a year ago because the temporary setups last the longest. So it's about time I made a full and proper miter saw station. Well, with a stop block, drawers, permanents, and everything. If you're wondering why I have 2 miter saws, it's a valid question. This one's for cutting wood, and this one's for cutting steel. This one was initially going to be my multi-purpose miter saw for cutting everything from wood to steel, because that's how they advertise it, but it's crap at cutting wood. The thing is about as accurate as measurements taken by a 5-year-old. The fence on it isn't even straight, so I only use it for cutting steel, and that's my wood cutting saw. In my full and proper miter saw station, I am going to be having 2 saws, but it's not going to be this one and this one. I'm going to relocate this one to somewhere else. The 2 saws I'm going to have on my miter saw station are this one and a radial arm saw that I got off Facebook Marketplace for a whole $50. Now, if you're wondering why I want a miter saw and a radial arm saw in the same station, that's a good thing to wonder because that seems rather redundant. The reason I want a radial arm saw is for one reason and one reason alone. A radial arm saw can accept a dado blade, so I can cross-cut dados, grooves, half-laps, rabbets, whatever, on long boards without an issue. If I want to cross-cut that sort of thing on the table saw, well, that can be cumbersome, unwieldy, and kind of dangerous at times. And with the size of my shop, if I wanted to cut, let's say, a half-lap on the end of an 8-foot-long board, well, it's impossible because I don't have enough space. But with a radial arm saw with a dado blade in there, it's easy. I just slap the board down on the table and go with the saw and the half-lap's cut. I could even do that on the end of a 16-foot-long board. Providing nothing's in the way of the other end of the board, it's easy. So that's why I'm going to have a miter saw and a radial arm saw in my new station. Oh my God. Ow. Oh God. What am I, old? This is going to be the top of the miter saw station. This was the top of a conference table that I got for free from my last job because I stole it. Okay, no, they just gave it to me, but that's not as interesting of a story. This, I believe, started out life as a dining table from IKEA, but then they converted it to a conference table by putting it in a conference room and doing nothing else. I also have the glass top that was sitting on top of this thing. It's 10 feet of glass that, I don't know, I could use for something in the future, but all I need for this miter saw station is this, cut in half lengthways, which we'll do later. First things first, I need to break down 3 sheets of plywood using my quick measure saw track system. For this next step, it'd be very nice if I already had the thing that I'm currently building. For all these horizontal runner pieces here, I need to cut them to length and cut a series of shallow dados in them for alignment purposes. It'd be much faster to cut them to length if I had a miter saw station with a stop block in it. I could just zip out a series of repeated cuts and they'd be all exactly the same length. It's not going to be too hard to just eyeball the cut on the miter saw, but it'd be nicer if I had a stop block. For cutting this series of shallow dados, it'd be very nice if I had a radial arm saw with a dado stack in it, so I could just set up a stop block and go zoop, zoop, zoop 8 times and have all of my dados in exactly the same spot. But I don't have that yet. These boards are far too long to run over my table saw sideways for cutting the dados, so to cut the dados in these, I have to use a router with a speed square as an edge guide. I've already marked and measured all of these. It took a very long time. So now let's get to routing all of these dados. That was the last dado. Next, I need to cut several notches in these vertical pieces for the horizontal runners to index into. And to do that, I've set up a stop block on my table saw to cut these notches in the form of a plywood blade sheath. It looks a little precarious, but I think it's safe. Now it's time to assemble the basic cabinet structure, which I'll be doing using glue in these dado joints and pin nails to hold everything together while the glue dries. Both of these base cabinets are fully assembled and the glue has had a chance to dry, and they're very strong, except in this direction. Quite a bit of racking to them, which makes sense because the only resistance to racking are these two 2-inch wide strips at the very top and the very bottom of the cabinet. So to fix this issue and to structuralize the cabinet a little bit more, I'm going to cut down some 1/4-inch thick sheets of plywood and glue and pin them to the back of the cabinet to add resistance to racking and to add a back to the cabinet. The 1/4-inch backs are now in place on both cabinet bases, and unfortunately, I glued this back on just a little bit out of square. It's not enough to make a real difference, but it's enough to bother me. It's only about 1/8 of an inch off between the top and the bottom. By the time I realized this mistake, I had 2 sides of this back fully pinned in place, so it was a bit too late to change anything. Oh well. Now the next thing I want to do is to make some wraparound legs for each corner of the cabinet out of plywood. I'm even going to add a taper to one side for aesthetics. Now these legs will be partly for aesthetics, but also partly for some extra structural rigidity, and they'll lift the cabinet box off the ground by 1 inch on each corner. But first, I'm going to put leveling feet on all 4 corners of each cabinet to, level them. And I would put an extra leveling foot on the middle of each cabinet to keep the middle of the cabinet from sagging over time, but I didn't get enough leveling feet for that, so instead, while I have the cabinets here and upside down, I'm going to put 2 threaded inserts in the middle rung of each cabinet, into which I will screw a carriage bolt, which will touch the ground and keep the middle of the cabinets from sagging over time. And they're going to be proper leveling feet with rubber pads and everything, but they'll do the job of anti-saggery. That's a dog bed. Here's all the leg assemblies glued up, and I made a mistake. One side of these leg assemblies is straight, and the other side has a slight taper to it. And the idea was supposed to be on each end of the cabinet you have an opposing taper for a little bit of design. But I glued all of these up in the same direction. So instead of having an opposing taper on each end of the cabinet, you have this, which is wrong. So to fix this, I'm just going to take each one of these leg assemblies to the table saw and cut off the taper and make both sides the same, because I didn't account for the change of direction to make an opposing taper happen. And then after that, I'm going to sand the faces of these, round over the edges, and then glue them to the base cabinets. Not everything was perfectly lined up on these base cabinets, so before I install the legs, I'm going to go over the edges with a flush trim bit and the router to clean them up and make them flush. This, as I already said, is the top to an old conference table that I got for free, and I'm going to be using it as the top to both of the cabinets that will make up my new miter saw station. Which means the first thing I have to do to this thing aside from take all the hardware off the bottom is cut it in half. The construction of this top is fairly interesting. It's a pretty good example of cheap mass-produced furniture. It's a 1/4 inch thick layer of particle board on either side with foam sandwiched in the middle. On the edges here, we're closer to the edges, it's 1/2 inch thick particle board, and all the way on the edges, it's like 1.5 inch thick particle board chunk lining the edges. I had taken a hole saw to one of the end tables that came with this previously, and I thought that the whole construction of this table was like it is on the end here with 1/2 inch particle board with a foam core, but as it turns out, most of it is 1/4 inch particle board, so that'll make inlaying a T-track for the miter saw stop rather interesting, but that's a problem I'll have to come to later. I'll be attaching the top to the bases using simple pocket screws, so I might as well get to drilling a bunch of pocket holes. These two cabinets are very nearly ready to be flipped over and put in their place. But before I can do that, I need to tackle a couple things on the cabinet. Mainly, on this one, I need to cut a place for the radial arm saw to sit. I made both of these cabinets identical for ease of assembly, and so I wouldn't mess anything up. But I made all of these compartments spaced the right size so that a radial arm saw would fit in there, so I could pick any one of them and cut out these struts and some stuff in the back and make room for the radial arm saw. And it's on this cabinet, in this compartment, that I'm going to choose to put the radial arm saw in. Now I have a small issue. I was planning to slot the base of the radial arm saw into here and to screw it to the underside of the top. But that's before I learned I only have a 1/4 inch of particle board to screw into, so that's not going to work. What I'm going to do instead is slide the radial arm saw base in here and then mount 2 rails on these side panels here for the base to sit onto, and I'll screw it positively into that. So now I got to make some rails. Next, I need to install all these leveling feet. Now I get to do the exciting job of taking everything down from the shelf and taking down the shelf, because all of it's in the way. I gotta find a temporary home for all of this crap until I get drawers made for the miter saw station. Very exciting stuff. Forget this manual stuff. Stand back. Oh no, the shelf broke. That's a shame because I loved it so much. It was one of my favorite creations. I'm so torn up about. Ow! Oh, that was solid. Ow! I hit myself with a hammer. Okay, now we're good. All right, I disposed of the majority of the shelf in the appropriate manner. And now it's time to clean up these little bits. All the remnants. I've got both cabinets down off the workbench and onto the ground now. They're still both on dollies so I can move them around, but they're roughly where they're going to end up. Now this one, I need to pull it away from the wall, take it off the dolly so I can stick a radial arm saw in its back. Oh, it fits in there perfectly. Like a glove. It's almost like I measured it. I just spent about 2 hours lining up this radial arm saw. It took many a bangings with the mallet, a couple shims, and even moving the runners that the radial arm saw is sitting on, but now the run of the blade is parallel with the tabletop. It was off by about 1/4 of an inch at the beginning. And it's square with this strip of wood, which is parallel to the front edge of the table. And as an added bonus, this radial arm saw is at the perfect height that if I just tilt this blade guard back, in a pinch, I can have an emergency appendectomy. If you're familiar with radial arm saws, you'll know that usually the worktop for a radial arm saw is a sacrificial piece of MDF or plywood or something, and you may be wondering, why am I using a non-sacrificial countertop for this thing? Well, like I said at the beginning of the video, I plan to only use this thing with a dado blade, which means no through cuts. If I need to do a through cut on something, I'm going to be using the miter saw. So, unless I mess up, this blade should never come in contact with this top. I've taken these two cabinets off their rolly-dolly feet, set them on their leveling feet, and I've been faffing around with the leveling feet, and now both of these cabinets are, as near as I can get it, coplanar with each other and level front to back. They're not level side to side, and the reason for that is simply because the slope in this floor is too huge. I did try leveling this one out, all four corners, and when I was done, that end of the cabinet was about 1.5 inches off the ground. So if I wanted to make that other cabinet over there coplanar with this one and at the same height, well then it'd have to be floating off the ground by like 2 to 3 inches. So instead, they're both off level at the same angle, and they're coplanar with each other, and they're level front to back, so that's good enough. I am going to mount these cabinets to the floor with Tapcon screws and L brackets so they'll be fixed in place and cannot move, but before I do that, I need to work on the thing that's going to link these two cabinets together, the miter saw shelf. You know, the central point of this whole thing. And this is what's going to serve as my miter saw shelf. It's one of 2 extension wings that came with the conference table, so it's perfect. I mean, I did have my drill press sitting on top of here, so my drill press is now homeless. But it's for a good cause. So now I need to cut this to the proper length and make some runners for it to sit on. And I can screw the runners in place with the aid of this spacer block here. All right, let's see how lined up it is without any sort of shims or adjustment or any of that crap. By the way, you can now see why I purchased this miter saw. It's because of the rail forward design. Keeps it further away from the wall, as opposed to the saws that the rail sticks way back behind the saw and you have no room for anything back there. This one I can go right up next to the wall. And let's see. Oh my God, that's only off by like a 32nd of an inch. Maybe a 16th on this side. That's incredible. All right, just a little shimming up and some lining up is in order, and then it'll be good. Half an hour of shimming later, and that's perfect. That's perfect, and this fence is perfectly square and lined up with the fence on the radial arm saw. And I rechecked the cabinets for level. Everything is set up and ready to go. The only problem is the very back of this miter saw here, and it's fully at position. The extension cord rubs against the wall, but it's only in the upper position, and I'm not going to worry about it. Because if I were to move this cabinet out even half of an inch, I'd have to redo absolutely everything and readjust it all over again, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to let the cord rub a little bit. Now the next thing to do is to, maybe I'll cut a hole in the wall in the future, I don't know. Next thing to do is to lock these cabinets down to the concrete floor using a hammer drill and some Tapcon screws. Next, I want to install this T-track into the top for my stop block. Now, normally with this stuff, you just route a groove for the T-track, in this case 3/4 of an inch wide, 3/8 of an inch deep, slot the T-track into that routed groove, screw it down, and voila, you got your T-track installed. But as you might have already guessed, with this countertop, it's not going to be quite that straightforward. This is the problem. Over here, the routing was only deep enough to hit the particle board, but here, where the particle board was only 1/4 of an inch deep, I routed straight through to the foam core. Now, initially, I thought I was going to have to dig this foam core out and put some wooden insert blocks in here, but this foam core is actually extremely rigid, so I'm just going to try to hammer the T-track in place, screw it down. The screws for the foam core part will have to go all the way through to the other side of the top, but I think the foam will be rigid enough to support it. It's just a stop block system. It's not like I'm putting clamping rails on here. So I'm going to try it without any sort of wooden insert in here and just see how it goes. All right, this one's straight into the foam. Let's see if I can go through to the other side. I think that'll be fine. Interestingly, I didn't route through to the foam on this side. I guess the construction of it isn't quite as uniform as I thought it was. Feels like there's only about 1/8 of an inch of particle board here, but it's not non-existent. Thought that was interesting. Anyway, let's install the T-track into this groove. After waking up all the neighbors within a 3-mile radius with my voracious midnight hammering, the T-tracks are installed and ready to use, and I topped them off with some nice ornamental stop blocks that I made by gluing together some random hardwood scraps I had lying around. So now my miter saw station has stop blocks made of walnut, padauk, zebra wood, and purple heart. Quite honestly, the purple heart and walnut look gross together, but that's okay because it's a stop block on a miter saw station. I don't think anyone's going to mind. Except maybe me. Now both of these stop blocks do have a little runner made of walnut underneath them to keep them square within the T-track, and this one has a little cursor pointing to a measuring tape, so I have something to index by. I didn't put a measuring tape on the other side because I didn't know what it indexed to, if it should index to the radial arm saw or the miter saw, so I just left it indexless. So now I have a nice stable home for my arm chopper and my disemboweler. Now this miter saw station clearly is not fully completed yet, but this video is. In part 2 of the miter saw station build, I'll be adding faces and drawers and stuff to finish off this cabinet. But I think before I do that, I'm going to add dust collection, because there isn't any at all right now, and that's the reason you haven't seen me use this miter saw, because I don't want to get my cabinets dirty. So I'm going to add dust collection to, well, my whole shop before I tackle finishing off these cabinets. So until then, see you later. Thanks for watching.